Education spending is the second largest element of public service spending in the UK, behind health, representing about 99 billion in 2021-2022 in today's prices, or about 4.5% of national income. Up to 2010, the total level of education spending was rising over time. Education spending then fell by 8% as public spending cuts began to take effect from 2010 onwards. School spending per pupil in England fell by 9% in real terms over the decade up to 2019-20. Planned increase in school budgets will allow spending per pupil to return to 2010 levels by 2024, but that will mean a decade and a half with no overall growth in spending per pupil. Colleges and sixth forms have seen even bigger cuts, with a 14% cut for colleges and a 28% cut for school sixth forms over the last decade. And despite extra funding, spending levels in 2024-25 still won't return back to 2010 levels. Cuts in school spending have not been felt equally either. The most deprived secondary schools saw a 14% real terms fall in spending per pupil between 2009-10 and 2019-20, compared with a 9% drop for the least deprived schools. This is due to the national funding formula providing bigger real terms increases for the least deprived schools than for the most deprived ones, and the pupil premium failing to keep pace with inflation since 2015. These patterns in school spending and larger cuts to spending on technical education run counter to the government's goal of levelling up poorer areas. Even more remarkable is that while school spending per pupil fell by 9% in real terms between 2009-10 and 2019-20, private school fees rose by 23% in real terms. This significantly increased the gap between state school and private school spending per pupil. In 2009-10, the gap between total state school spending per pupil and private school fees was about £3,100, or nearly 40%. By 2020-21, this had more than doubled to a difference of £6,500, or over 90%. Looking over the longer term, education spending as a share of national income has not risen since the early 1970s, when it stood at just under 5% of national income. This contrasts sharply with health spending, which has nearly doubled as a share of national income since the early 70s, from about 3.5% of national income to over 7% during most of the last decade. 30 years ago, in the early 1990s, education and health spending were very similar levels. By the late 2000s, health spending was about 30% greater than education spending, and then over 60% greater by 2019-20. This reflects the effects of an ageing society on spending needs, but also spending and policy choices made by successive governments that have tended to favour health spending over education spending. The next few years are likely to be particularly challenging for schools, colleges and universities, partly because of squeezes on education spending over the last decade, but also due to the effects of the pandemic on education. There is now significant evidence that pupils have fallen behind in their learning as a result of missed schooling during the pandemic, with estimates suggesting that average educational progress for school children is about 2 to 4 months behind previous cohorts. And there have been even larger falls in maths, amongst younger children and amongst more disadvantaged pupils. The government has allocated an additional £4.9 billion in England to help with education catch-up and recovery, but this falls a long way short of the £15 billion that the Education Recovery Commissioner recommended. This work was produced with funding from the Nuffield Foundation. To find out more about how education funding is changing, visit www.ifs.org.uk/education spending.